committee for that definitive introduction. I just want to comment that the number of people here is disappointing, but it's indicative of the ignorance that the general population in South Texas has of the Civil War and what occurred here in the Civil War and their ancestors that took part in the Civil War. So we hope over time, over the next 5 years, that we'll rectify some of these ignorance. I put, there's going to be some overlap here because Steve and I were just talking and maybe we got our assignments slightly mixed up. Anyway, I titled this presentation, The Mindset of the North, South, and Texas Prior to the Civil War. When I thought about this assignment, I knew I would have difficulty in addressing the subject. There are many books that have been written, if not the most on any subject in English in the United States, probably about the Civil War. And the subject is undergoing continued assessment and revision, so it's far from being in a static state. Some of you may have read this article that appeared in the Valley Morning Star April 12th of this year. It's from a Florida columnist in case you get created, Leonard Pitts Jr. And the headline is titled, Civil War was about slavery, nothing more. He provides in the column a brief explanation. The proposition is far too simplistic, and I reject the premise that he makes. He selectively furnishes 3 quotes from several sources that touch on the importance of the Negro and slavery, but he omits any and all other aspects of the underlying reasons for the situation of the war, the instigation. One of the best explanations I found was an American history book written by a teacher at MMA, Dr. Thatcher. He was dissatisfied with the way history books were being written for high school students, and he wrote his own book. At the very last minute, a couple days ago, I opened it up and I looked at it, and I discovered that he had written an extremely good chapter on the Civil War. And a lot of the material I'm going to present to you is an excerpt from that. Jumping over the Civil War to the end, I want to quote him because this is probably the most significant impact of the war. And as a libertarian, I thoroughly agree with what he says. Quote, America became a national state after the conclusion of the war for Southern independence. Having decided the issue of national sovereignty, not with the consent of the people, but by force of arms, the federal government consolidated its power irreversibly over those of the individual states. The establishment of the American nation-state diminished, if not demolished, the very principle upon which founders had based the Constitution as an instrument for lawful self-government. In other words, what we're living with today, the strong federal government, was the outgrowth of what happened during the Civil War. And that is, in my mind, the most extremely significant point to make about the impact of the Civil War. You've heard the expression, history is written by the victors. And so I want to just say that the name Civil War is a northern one, and erroneously, because the word civil implies a fight over the control of a common government, whereas the South they design a separate government. So the name civil is erroneous in which to begin, but that's what we live with. Other names for the war were the war between the states, both and often the South used that expression. The war of secession, the war of rebellion was used only by the North. And the war of non-aggression was used by the South. And perhaps the accurate term which Thacker likes is the war for Southern independence. And I like that expression. And it's too bad that it doesn't get picked up and used more often. There are many reasons for the war, and I'm going to give you some of the attitudes and bring you into the reason why I believe and concur with Thacker that the war was all about. He lists 5 forces. One of them is sovereignty. Second one is political and cultural. Third is tariffs. Fourth is slavery, and the fifth is the honor system. And he lists those, as he believes, in order of importance. In other words, slavery is 1, 2, 3, and the fourth reason on his list. The question of sovereignty and states' rights was largely unresolved prior to the war. Since the time of Washington, the federal government was weak and was actually getting weaker, and states were assuming more control over their own interests. So, when the North instigated the war, they were trying to resolve the issue of sovereignty is the number one issue. Number 2 is the political and cultural aspects. And briefly put, the North was more community-minded, and it was becoming more democratic. And that's not the party, it's just democratic in nature, due to the colonization of the area west of the Appalachians. There was a tremendous flux in the makeup of the North because people were moving out of the East Coast and they were moving across the Appalachians, and they were going into the old Northwest territories, which became Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin and those areas. And these people were very independent, and they were very democratic in nature, as opposed to the old New Englanders who still carried some of the Republican ideas that they had got from the Tories in England. The South, however, was the bastion of independence, personal independence, and Republican consensus. In other words, they believed in states' rights and the rights of home districts to rule themselves. Third was the problem of tariffs. In order to protect the industries in the North, there was a large imposition of tariffs on foreign goods. And that burden fell upon the South, as many of you know. Then we go to the issue of slavery, and I'm only going to comment by saying, in quoting what Thacker said, the Union did not fight the war in order to free slaves. Well, that becomes very evident when you study the nature of the war. At the beginning of the secession, 5 Union states, Missouri, Kentucky, what would become West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware, they have large slave populations, and they were not immediately freed. The Emancipation Proclamation was a huge political ploy. What Lincoln tried to do is tell the Southern states that had seceded, if you come back, we'll take you back without any impositions of crime, or we won't try to get back at you. That failed miserably. And so the emancipation was issued. So what did it do? It only emancipated supposedly the slaves in the southern states. So it had no effect whatsoever. And there were also, as I mentioned, there were also slaves in those 5 border states. And just out of curiosity, you might be interested in it. At the time of the Revolutionary War, slaves constituted 14% of the population of New York, 7.5% in New Jersey, and even 10% in the state of Rhode Island. When Lincoln was elected, and he gave in his first inaugural address, he promised to enforce the Slave Fugitive Act. So what does that tell you? At the time of his inauguration, he wasn't thinking about freeing the slaves. That came later. And the fifth thing I mentioned was honor and obligation. Southern society still adhered in part to the obligation of honor and chivalry. And this carries back to England and New York, and gentleman codes and stuff like that. And this, in part, moved some in the South to defend their heritage. And we might think of Robert E. Lee as somebody who probably felt chivalrous about his ancestors and what they had accomplished. So he felt a heartfelt move